Russia and the Western nations have exchanged about 26 high-profile international prisoners in what is being dubbed as the biggest swap of its kind after the Cold War. Turkey has mediated this landmark exercise. The American President Joe Biden hailed the prisoner swap with Russia and said that this was a feat of diplomacy.
Moments ago, the families and I were able to speak to them on the telephone from the Oval Office. They're out of Russia. Earlier today, they were flown to Turkey, and soon they'll be wheels up on their way home to see their families. This is an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's a relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time. The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request, and I personally thank them all again. And I've thanked them personally, and I'll thank them again.
The prisoner exchange ceremony at the Ankara airport saw some milestone swaps designed to build bridges between Russia and the West. The Turkish officials have said that Russia has released the American journalist Evan Gershkovich and the former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan. On the other side, Germany is reported to have released the Russian Vadim Krasikov, who was in prison for killing a former Chechen rebel commander in a brazen assassination. The Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, remember, was detained in Yekaterinburg in March 2023 and was convicted in July 2023, and he was accused of spying. The United States had denounced the trial as a sham. Gershkovich was recently sentenced to 16 years in prison. The former American Marine Paul Whelan was working as a corporate security executive from the United States when he was detained in Moscow in 2018. He too had been accused of espionage. Now, Paul Whelan and the American government have denied these charges, and the detention was a source of tensions. Now, this is the first prisoner exchange between Russia and the West since 2022, when the star American basketball player Brittany Griner had been swapped for convicted Russian arms dealer Victor Bout. This also happens to be the biggest exchange of prisoners since 2010, when 14 alleged spies were exchanged between Russia and the West. All right, now to give us more perspective on this, we're being joined by our correspondent Susan Tehrani, who's joining us live from New York. Susan, this, of course, is a bit of a big breakthrough where the West and Russia seem to have agreed upon the exchange of these prisoners.
Yeah, it is also a legacy-defining moment for the Biden administration. President Biden, during that speech, wanted to make very clear that he was the one that was on the calls making these requests, and that the release was done at his request, and that the freeing of Americans held abroad had been a policy focus of his since the beginning of his administration, since taking office. On the other hand, as you mentioned, it is a very important time in history because it's the largest prisoner swap in the post-Soviet era between Russia and the West, with so many countries involved. And ultimately, once these prisoners come home, there's definitely going to be a lot of jubilation, not only here in the United States, but in the West as well. President Biden also talked about how alliances are important and how U.S. allies pull through when the United States needs them.
Right, and also considering that this has happened at a time when there is this raging war that's going on in Ukraine, do we expect this to just be an isolated sort of an agreement that the West and Russia have reached, or do we expect some kind of a tour also in the conflict that's ongoing in the Ukraine war?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. It really comes at a time that was a bit confusing for some analysts, considering the fact that Ukraine just received those F-16 jets. And also, when President Biden was asked whether or not this might be a pathway to better relations between the U.S. and Russia, he said he hoped so. But then with a follow-up, when he was asked whether or not he'll be in contact with Vladimir Putin, well, he said, I have nothing to say to Putin. I have nothing to talk about with him. And that's significant because for the Russians, having at least that line of communication was important. We learned that when the Russian foreign minister Lavrov was here, and I asked him about relations with the U.S. and the Trump administration, and he said despite the fact that President Trump was very hard on Russia with sanctions, lines of communications were open at the highest level, and that decreased tensions.
I think that's a significant point there. Thank you very much indeed, Susan Tehrani, for joining us and getting us all those details there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.